Hello everyone, this video is an introduction to part writing. Essentially, part writing is connecting a series of chords in such a way that is in accordance with a set of rules. But before learning what those rules are, or how to follow them, you first need to know how to write a chord correctly over 4 voices. So in order to talk about how to do that, we're going to talk about range, the range allowed in each of the 4 voices, the spacing allowed between the 2 voices, and the doubling allowed for each voice. So our 4 voices are the soprano voice, the alto voice, the tenor voice, and the bass voice. And like a normal voice, or any kind of instrument, they have a specific range. So the soprano voice goes from a C4 to a G5. The alto voice goes from a G3 to a C5. The tenor voice goes from a C3 to a G4, and the bass voice goes from an E2 to a C4. Now, a few ways to remember this are that all of these notes together are a C major chord. They make up a C major chord. The upper 3 voices only have C's and G's, and the bass voice is the only one that has an E. The soprano and tenor voice have the same range, except the tenor range is an octave lower than the soprano range. The alto and soprano ranges are inverses of each other, so the lowest note for an alto is the highest note for a soprano, and the lowest note for a soprano is the highest note for an alto. Now, not the exact same note, but the same letter name. And the alto and bass ranges have the same highest note, just the bass is an octave lower. And in general, the bass is the oddball with the range, as it has the largest range, and it's the only one that has a C, and that has an E in it, excuse me. Now we go to spacing. So in spacing, it's very important that these voices are kept within a certain range, but don't go into a different territory. So what I mean by that is that the soprano always needs to be the highest voice. The alto always needs to be the second highest voice. The tenor always needs to be the second lowest voice, and the bass always needs to be the second lowest. Always needs to be the lowest voice. Excuse me. So, if one of them switches positions, that's incorrect. That's called voice crossing, and that's not allowed in part writing. At the other extreme, they can't be too far apart, or else they're not really felt as being a part of the ensemble. So here we have an example of voice crossing. The tenors are at a G4, and the altos are at an E4. Now this means that the tenors are above the altos, and that's not allowed. So to fix this, we'd move the tenors down and the altos up. And now we arrive at something that is totally correct, and is called closed voicing. This means that between the upper 3 voices, we cannot add another chord tone. Since this is a C major chord, we can't add another E, G, or C in between these upper 3 voices. Now we go to the example where the voices are too far apart. If we look at the tenor and alto voice, they're much farther than an octave apart. They're actually an 11th apart, or an octave and a perfect fourth. And this is also incorrect. Now you may be wondering about the bass and the tenor. It actually turns out that the bass and tenor voice can be as far apart as they want. Again, the bass is being a bit of an oddball. So why don't we write this chord correctly? Let's switch the altos and sopranos, and let's move the tenor up. So now we have something called an open-voiced chord. Now, the opposite of closed voicing, this means that we can fit another chord tone in between the upper 3 voices. So we could fit in an E4 right here, and that would be another chord tone that could fit in between the upper 3 voices. So just another note on closed voicing. I'm not sure if I mentioned this. It doesn't matter how many chord tones you can fit in between the bass and tenor. It only matters about the upper 3 voices. It's just something to keep in mind, because otherwise it can get a bit confusing. Now let's go to doubling. In general, on a chord, you always have to have the root in the 3rd. If it's a 7th chord, you have to have the 7th, because without it, it wouldn't be a 7th chord. you can only leave out the fifth. the only part of a chord you can leave out is the fifth. Otherwise, you're leaving out too much information. So, something that you can never double are tendency tones. So, tendency tones, or the third, that is. So, in a seventh chord, you can't double the seventh again, because if you do, then that's a tendency tone, and you can't double tendency tones. If you're in a C major chord and you have two E's in it, that's incorrect because you can't double the third. So really what that leaves you to double is the root or the fifth, and it's figuring out which inversions to do which. That's the real trick. So let's go with a root position chord. So that means that the root is in the bass. Now, in a root position chord, you want to double the bass. Now that's the same as saying you want to double the root. Either one works. It means the same thing as the root is in the bass. So then in a first inversion chord where the third is in the bass, you, as you always do not want to double the third. If you do, that's wrong. So you want to double the soprano, which in this case turns out to be the root. So you want to double the root. However, if the soprano were here, then you want to double the soprano still. So that's what the altos are doing. And that'd be doubling the fifth. Then for a second inversion chord, you want to double the bass again, which turns out to be the fifth this time. And then you just do this. So you double the bass again in this case. So right now I'm letting the soprano voice do that. Then if we were to change this into a C dominant 7 and we were in third inversion, you would again not want to double the bass because it's a tendency tone. And you would want, well actually you wouldn't double anything in this case because there are 4 notes, so you don't really need to worry about it with third inversion. But if you were to double something, you would double the soprano. In general, there's a hierarchy of doubling. First you want to double the bass. But if the bass is a tendency tone or is the third of the chord, then you want to double the soprano. If the soprano ends up being any of those things, then you want to double an inner voice. So those are the basics of part writing. If you want, see more about how they're applied.